My brother called every hospital in the county and told them I had stolen medication from our family's pharmacy. I graduated top of my nursing class with a 4 gigapascals and a letter of commendation from my clinical supervisor. I could not get hired for 18 months. When people ask me how that happens, I tell them it's actually very simple. All you need is a brother who has been groomed his entire life to believe he is untouchable. A father who looks the other way because confronting the truth would cost him something. And a small enough town that everyone knows everyone, and nobody wants to be the one who hired the girl from the Whitfield family. The one they say stole from her own parents. The one who got kicked out of the house at 24 and showed up to a job interview smelling like the extended stay motel on Route 9 because that was exactly where she was living. That was me. My name is Claire. And this is the true story of how my family tried to bury me. And why they failed. I grew up in Hartwell, a town of about 40,000 people in central Ohio. My father built Whitfield Family Pharmacy from a single storefront into a small chain of 3 locations over 30 years. He was proud of that. He talked about it the way other men talk about their children, with a kind of reverence that made it clear the business was the real legacy and the children were just supporting cast. My brother, Daniel, was 4 years older than me and had understood from a very young age exactly what role he was expected to play. He was charming in the way that people who have never faced real consequences tend to be charming. He smiled easily. He remembered people's names. He shook hands firmly and looked you in the eye and said exactly what you needed to hear. My father called him a natural. My mother, who passed away when I was 11, used to say quietly that charm without character was just a costume. I missed her every single day. Daniel had been managing the flagship location since he was 26. My father handed it to him the same way you'd hand someone a gift they'd been promised since birth. There was no interview, no discussion of whether Daniel was the right choice. It simply happened, and everyone around the dinner table nodded like it made perfect sense. I had never wanted to run the pharmacy. I wanted to be a nurse. I had wanted it since I was 9 years old, and sat in the hospital waiting room while my mother had her first surgery, and watched the nurses move through that space with a kind of calm authority that made me feel like the world had some order to it after all. I told my father that when I was applying to college, he said it was a nice idea but that he hoped I would come back and help with the business eventually. I smiled and said of course and applied to the nursing program at Ohio State anyway. I graduated 3.5 years later with a 4 gigapascals. My clinical supervisor, a woman named Patricia, who had been a nurse for 26 years, wrote in my letter of recommendation that I was one of the most naturally gifted students she had supervised in a decade. I came home to Hartwell that summer with my degree, my certification, and a genuine belief that the hardest part was behind me. I was 22 years old and I had no idea what was about to happen. The first sign came 3 weeks after I moved back. I had applied to Hartwell Regional, the largest hospital in our county, for a position in their medical surgical unit. I had submitted my transcripts, my certifications, my letter from Patricia, everything. The recruiter had called me back within 48 hours to schedule an interview. I spent a week preparing. I bought a new blazer. I researched the unit's patient population and prepared thoughtful answers to every question I could anticipate. The morning of the interview, I sat in the waiting room and felt genuinely hopeful for the first time in months. Then the recruiter came out, not to bring me back for the interview, but to tell me, quietly, and with visible discomfort, that they would not be moving forward with my application. She could not tell me why. She was sorry. I drove home in a daze. I assumed I had done something wrong. Maybe my application had a formatting issue. Maybe Patricia's letter had gotten lost. I applied to 2 other facilities in the area and received the same result: initial interest, then a sudden, unexplained withdrawal. No feedback, no explanation, just silence. I asked my father if he had heard anything. He looked at his coffee cup and said sometimes the job market was competitive and I should be patient. He did not meet my eyes. It was my coworker at the coffee shop where I had taken a part-time job who finally told me. Her name was Renee, and she had a cousin who worked in human resources at one of the clinics where I had applied. Her cousin had mentioned, in passing, that the Whitfield girl's application had been flagged because someone from her family had called and reported that she had been caught stealing controlled substances from the family pharmacy and that the family had chosen not to press charges out of loyalty, but felt an obligation to warn healthcare employers in the area. I sat in the break room after Renee told me that, and I did not move for a very long time. Someone from my family. I knew immediately who it was. My father did not make phone calls. He had people for that, and the person he had always relied on most was Daniel. I went home that night and confronted my brother directly. I found him in the kitchen, eating leftover pasta, and watching something on his laptop, completely at ease, in the way that people are when they have done something terrible and convinced themselves it was justified. I asked him if he had called my prospective employers and told them I was a thief. He looked at me for a moment, and then he smiled. Not a guilty smile. Not even an uncomfortable one. He smiled the way you smile when someone asks you a question you've been waiting for. I protected the family's reputation, he said. You were going to take a job at a hospital, and people were going to ask questions about us. About the pharmacy. I handled it. I asked him what he was talking about. I had never stolen anything. I had never touched the pharmacy's medication inventory, except to help with a count one summer when I was 19 and my father had asked me to. That's not what the records show, he said, and went back to his pasta. I stood there in the kitchen of the house I had grown up in and understood, with complete clarity, that my brother had fabricated evidence. That he had access to the pharmacy's inventory records. That he had almost certainly created a discrepancy and filed it somewhere that could be pointed to. And that because my father had built a world in which Daniel was always right, there was no version of this conversation that ended with my father choosing me. I went to my father that night anyway. I told him everything Renee had told me. I showed him my certifications, my transcript, my letter from Patricia. I asked him to call Daniel into the room and ask him directly. My father listened to everything I said. Then he was quiet for a long time. Then he said that Daniel had mentioned there had been some irregularities, and that he was sure it was probably just a misunderstanding, but that it might be better for everyone if I took some time before pursuing hospital work, and maybe in the meantime I could help out at the pharmacy counter. Help out at the pharmacy counter. After 4 years of a nursing degree. After Patricia's letter. After 18 months of clinical rotations. I left that night. I packed 2 suitcases, and I left. I want to explain something here, because I know what some people will think when they hear this. They will think, why didn't you just move? Why didn't you go somewhere they didn't know you? And that is a fair question, and the answer is that I tried. I applied to a hospital in Columbus 3 weeks after I left. I applied to one in Cleveland. I applied to one in Cincinnati. Each time, I got the same result: initial interest, then silence. What I eventually understood was that my brother had not just called local employers. He had reached out to healthcare networks and state nursing boards and implied, without ever making a formal complaint that could be investigated, that my certification was under review. He was strategic about it. He left fingerprints that were too faint to follow but heavy enough to poison every door I approached. I was 24 years old, living in an extended-stay motel on Route 9, working double shifts at the coffee shop and picking up weekend shifts stocking shelves at a grocery store. I had approximately $1,100 in my account, and a nursing degree I could not use. I had one friend in Hartwell who still answered my calls. A woman named Greta who had gone to high school with me and now worked at the town library. I had a leaking bathroom faucet in my motel room that the management had promised to fix for 6 weeks. I kept my certifications current. I completed my continuing education requirements on my laptop in that motel room at 11 o'clock at night because I refused to let them expire. I did not know exactly what I was waiting for. I just knew that giving up felt like letting Daniel win, and I was not ready to do that. It was Greta who told me about the position. She called me on a Tuesday morning in February, 17 months after I had left my father's house. She said she had heard through someone at her library board that Street committed someone, Augustine Medical Center, a mid-sized hospital about 20 miles outside of Hartwell that had just completed a major expansion, was hiring nursing staff at a scale they hadn't seen in years. The hiring process was being led by a new director of nursing who had come in from outside the area and was building her team independently. From outside the area. Someone who didn't know the Whitfield name. I submitted my application that afternoon. 3 days later, I received a call from a recruiter named Marcus, asking me to come in for an initial interview. I drove to that interview in the used Honda Civic I had bought with 8 months of coffee shop savings. I wore the same blazer I had bought for the Hartwell regional interview, which I had kept pressed and hung carefully in my motel room closet because some part of me had always believed I would need it again. I arrived 20 minutes early and sat in my car and breathed. The lobby of Street Augustine was bright and clean-smelling. The woman at the front desk smiled at me. Marcus came out to greet me, and was warm and professional and walked me back to a small conference room where he said the director of nursing would be joining shortly. I sat down and folded my hands in my lap and waited. The door opened, and the woman who walked in was not the director of nursing. She was older, perhaps 60, with silver hair and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She was carrying a manila folder. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I could not immediately read, something between recognition and relief, and then she sat down across from me and set the folder on the table between us. She said her name was Helen Marsh, and that she was the hospital's chief of staff. She said she wanted to speak with me before the formal interview began, because there was something she needed to give me first. She opened the folder and slid a sealed envelope across the table toward me. The envelope was cream-colored and slightly yellowed at the edges. My name was written on the front in handwriting I recognized immediately, even though I hadn't seen it in 4 years. My heart stopped. It was my Uncle Raymond's handwriting. My Uncle Raymond was my mother's younger brother. He had been a quiet, observant man who worked as an accountant and had never married and spent most holidays at our house because he had nowhere else to go. My father had tolerated him in the way that people tolerate the relatives who come with a spouse, not warmly, but not unkindly either. Daniel had always dismissed Raymond as boring. I had loved him unreservedly. He had been the one adult in my childhood who always listened when I talked, who asked follow-up questions, who remembered things I had said months earlier and brought them up again. When my mother died, he sat with me in the hospital parking lot for 2 hours while my father handled paperwork, and he didn't try to say anything comforting. He just stayed. Raymond had died of a heart attack 5 years ago, when I was 22, the summer before I graduated. I had not been able to get to the funeral because I was in the middle of finals and could not afford to fly back. I had never forgiven myself for that. Helen Marsh said, "Your uncle came to see me 11 years ago. He was a patient here for a minor procedure. We had a long conversation during his recovery. He told me about your mother. He told me about you. He told me what he believed was going to happen." I looked at her. "He told you what was going to happen?" "He said that when you graduated and tried to build your career, your brother would find a way to stop you. He said your brother had done it before, that there had been a girl your brother had dated in high school whose father had planned to open a business that would compete with the pharmacy, and that Daniel had found a way to ruin the man's credit references quietly and efficiently, and that no one in your family had said a word." She paused. "Your uncle had kept records of it. He put them in this envelope, along with a notarized affidavit. And he asked me to hold it until someone named Claire Whitfield came to this hospital looking for a nursing position." My hands were shaking. I could not pick up the envelope. "He said to tell you," she continued, looking at her notes, "that your mother was right about everything, and that she made him promise before she died to make sure you had what you needed when the time came." I sat in that conference room and I cried, not delicately, not quietly. I pressed my hands over my face and I cried the way you cry when you have been holding something for 18 months that was always too heavy but you had no choice but to carry it. Helen Marsh handed me a box of tissues and waited. When I could speak again, I asked her what was in the envelope. She said she hadn't opened it. It was mine. But she said that Raymond had described its contents to her when he left it, and that based on what he had told her, it contained a notarized statement detailing the incident with the businessman whose credit had been destroyed, signed witness accounts from 2 former pharmacy employees who had observed Daniel manipulating inventory records on separate occasions, and a document from Raymond's own accounting practice, showing a pattern of financial irregularities in the pharmacy that he had flagged internally and that had been quietly buried. She said that she had also, in the 3 days between my application and this meeting, made some calls of her own, because Raymond had told her this day might come, and she had wanted to be prepared. She had spoken with the nursing board. She had spoken with 2 of the facilities where my applications had been withdrawn. In both cases, the board had received what appeared to be informal inquiries from a private number about my certification status. The number traced back to a burner phone, but the inquiries had been made from a device connected to a Wi-Fi network registered to Whitfield Family Pharmacy. Daniel had not been as careful as he thought. Helen Marsh looked at me across that conference room table and said, "I have already forwarded what I found to the state licensing board and to our hospital's legal team. I want you to understand that what was done to you was not just cruel. It was a criminal interference with your professional licensure, and it is actionable. What you choose to do with the contents of that envelope is entirely your decision. But I want you to know that this hospital will support whatever action you decide to take, and that the nursing position you applied for is yours if you want it." I pressed my palms flat on the table and looked at the envelope with my name on it in my uncle's handwriting, and I thought about a Tuesday night in a hospital parking lot when I was 11 years old, and a man who had stayed when he didn't have to. I thought about 18 months in a motel room on Route 9. I thought about the blazer in the closet. I thought about keeping my certifications current at 11 o'clock at night because I refused to let them lapse. I thought about my brother eating pasta and smiling. I picked up the envelope. I opened it. Inside was everything Helen had described, and more. There was a letter from Raymond addressed to me, written in his careful, even handwriting, that began, "Claire, if you are reading this, then it happened the way I was afraid it would. I am so sorry I wasn't there to stop it. But I need you to know that I saw it coming, and I did not leave you without a defense." He had documented everything. The girl's father, whose credit references had been quietly poisoned when she was 17. The pharmacy employees, both of whom had since left the company, who had watched Daniel adjust inventory numbers and had been too afraid of losing their jobs to say anything. The pattern of financial mismanagement that Raymond had identified as my father's accountant and that had been dismissed when he raised it. He had also included something I had not expected, a copy of his own will. Raymond had never married. He had no children. He had spent 40 years working quietly and carefully and saving the way people do when they have grown up without financial security and never quite stopped being afraid of losing it. His estate, when he died, had been valued at just under $900,000. He had left it entirely to me, but he had structured it as a trust, not a direct bequest, and he had written this in the letter with a directness that made me press my hand to my mouth. He had known that if he left it to me directly, my father and Daniel would find a way to challenge it or control it or ensure I never saw it. So he had placed it in a trust managed by a bank in Columbus, with instructions that it was to be released to me upon my presenting myself in person to the trust officer with a valid nursing license and proof of active nursing employment. He had made it so they couldn't take it. He had made it so the only way to claim it was to succeed. The money had been sitting in that trust for 4 years, waiting for me to find my way to it. I stared at that document for a long time. Then I looked up at Helen Marsh, who was watching me with the expression of someone who has been keeping a very important secret for a very long time and is deeply relieved to finally put it down. "He came here specifically because he wanted a witness," I said. "Someone who had no connection to my family. He was a thorough man," she said simply. I took the position at Street Augustine. I started the following Monday. The unit was busy and the team was good, and for the first time in nearly 2 years, I walked into a building in the morning with a purpose that felt like my own. 3 weeks after I started, I took a day off and drove to Columbus to meet with the trust officer at the bank. I brought my nursing license and my employment confirmation letter and the documentation from Raymond's estate attorney. The trust officer, a careful, methodical woman named Dr. Sandra, had been managing the account since Raymond's death and seemed quietly pleased to be releasing it to its intended recipient. $882,000, plus 4 years of interest. I drove back to Hartwell that evening and sat in the parking lot of the extended stay motel and looked at the deposit confirmation on my phone for a very long time. Then I called Greta and asked if she wanted to get dinner, and she said yes, and I didn't tell her anything over the phone because some things you have to say face to face. The legal process took longer. The state nursing board opened a formal investigation into the interference with my licensure within 6 weeks of Helen's referral. Daniel hired a lawyer immediately, which my father paid for, which told me everything I needed to know about where my father stood. The investigation found sufficient evidence to refer the matter to the county prosecutor's office. Daniel was charged with professional interference and defamation under Ohio law. He did not go to jail. I want to be honest about that, because I think people sometimes want the story to end with handcuffs, and I think that expectation can make the actual ending feel insufficient. He did not go to jail. He pled to a reduced charge, paid a significant fine, and was placed on probation. The pharmacy's operating license was reviewed, and 2 of the 3 locations were flagged for compliance issues that resulted in a suspension of their controlled substance dispensing authorization. My father had to bring in an outside management firm to stabilize the business. What mattered to me was not the punishment. What mattered to me was that there was now a public record, that anyone who looked up Daniel Whitfield's name would find it. That the 2 former employees who had been afraid to say anything for years had put their names on documents and been heard. That the businesses and clinics and hospitals where my name had been quietly poisoned received formal notifications from the state board clearing my record. What mattered to me was that it was real, that it had happened, that a man who had spent years operating in the comfortable shadow of plausible deniability had been forced, finally, into the light. My father called me 4 months after the charges were filed. It was the first time he had contacted me since I left. He called on a Sunday morning and I let it ring through to voicemail, and then I sat with the phone in my hand for a while before I listened to the message. He said he wanted to talk. He said he should have listened to me. He said he was sorry. I did not call him back that day, or that week. I am not someone who believes that forgiveness is owed on demand, or that an apology erases the cost of what was lost. I had lost 2 years. I had lost the early years of a career I had worked enormously hard for. I had lived in a motel room and carried something that was not mine to carry, and no Sunday morning voicemail could undo that. What I believed was that forgiveness, when and if it came, would have to be something I arrived at in my own time and on my own terms. Not because I was asked to, not because it was the gracious thing to do, but because I genuinely arrived there. I was not there yet. What I knew was this. I was 26 years old. I had a nursing position I had earned on my own merit. I had a bank account that my uncle had quietly built for me over decades, structured so carefully that not even my father's indifference or my brother's malice could reach it. I had colleagues I respected and a unit I was proud to work on, and a supervisor who had told me, 6 weeks in, that I had good instincts, and she was glad to have me. I had kept my certifications current in a motel room at 11 o'clock at night. I had worn the same blazer for 2 years because I refused to stop believing I would need it. I had never, not once, stolen anything. I thought about Raymond often. I thought about him sitting in a hospital bed somewhere in this same building, 11 years ago, talking to Helen Marsh about a niece he was worried about and a family he did not trust and a future he could already see taking shape. I thought about him making his calculations, setting up his documents, walking out of that bank in Columbus knowing he had done what he could. He had not been able to stop what happened to me, but he had made absolutely certain that what happened to me would not be the end of the story. I moved out of the motel in April. I found a small apartment in a town 15 minutes from Street Augustine, close enough to commute easily, far enough from Hartwell that I could breathe. It was a 1-bedroom on the 2nd floor of a converted Victorian, and it had tall windows and original hardwood floors, and a clawfoot bathtub that I had wanted my whole adult life without ever believing I would actually have one. I hung my nursing degree on the wall of the living room. Not because I needed to prove anything to anyone who came over, but because I had earned it and it was mine and I wanted to look at it. Greta came over the weekend. I moved in and helped me unpack boxes, and we ordered pizza and sat on the floor because I didn't have furniture yet, and she asked me, finally, the question she had been too careful to ask for months. She asked me if I was okay. I thought about it honestly, the way Raymond had always made me feel I could think about things honestly. I said that I was getting there. She nodded and handed me another slice of pizza, and we sat there on the floor of my new apartment in the last light of an April evening, and I thought about my mother, who had known that charm without character was just a costume. I thought about Raymond, who had spent his whole life paying quiet attention to the things that mattered. I thought about the two former employees who had been afraid to say anything for years and then, when given the chance, had put their names on the record anyway. I thought about Helen Marsh, who had been keeping a sealed envelope in a filing cabinet for 11 years because a man she met once had asked her to, and who had made phone calls on my behalf before I even knew she existed. I thought about how many people had quietly decided, at some point along the way, that what was happening to me was not right, and how all of those quiet decisions, had come together in a conference room on a February morning and changed everything. I had spent 18 months believing I was alone. I had not been alone. That was the thing I kept coming back to, in the months that followed. Not the money. Not the legal outcome. Not even my brother's name in a public record. It was the knowledge that there had been people paying attention, people who cared, people who had made choices I didn't know about, in order to make sure I had what I needed when the time came. My mother had made Raymond promise before she died. She had known, even then. She had seen what her son was becoming, and she had looked at her quiet, careful brother and asked him to watch over the daughter she was leaving behind. He had kept that promise for 14 years. If you have someone in your life who shows up quietly, who asks follow-up questions, who remembers what you said months ago, pay attention to that person. Not every protector announces themselves. Some of them work in the background, filing documents and making phone calls and leaving sealed envelopes with hospital administrators, doing the slow, patient work of making sure that when everything falls apart, you are not entirely without a foundation. Some of them you won't even know about until you're sitting in a conference room with your hands shaking, reading your own name on a yellowed envelope in handwriting you would recognize anywhere. I am a nurse. I am 26 years old. I work a job I love in a unit I am proud of, and I live in an apartment with tall windows and a clawfoot bathtub. My name is Claire Whitfield, and I was never a thief.